The ceiling of the Sistine Chapel contains 438 square meters of painted plaster, and the figure most visitors seek out immediately is the outstretched hand of God in the creation of Adam. They look at the fingers almost touching, at the gap of charged air between the divine and the human, and they see the composition that every introductory art history course uses as shorthand for the high Renaissance in Italy. What they have not been taught to look for is what surrounds the figure of God. The mantle of cloth and attendant figures billowing around the Creator forms a shape that no contemporary source thought to name. For nearly 500 years, it was understood as decorative drapery, an atmospheric device, the kind of compositional fill that any competent artist of the period might have employed to frame a central figure. No one examining the ceiling through the early 20th century appears to have asked why the shape is so precise, why its outline follows such a specific geometry, or why an artist as deliberate as Michelangelo di Lodovico Buonarroti Simoni would have given that much careful attention to what the standard account of the work describes simply as background. The answer to what it depicts arrived not from an art historian, but from a physician. In 1990, Frank Lynn Meshberger, a physician at St. John's Medical Center in Anderson, Indiana, published an analysis in the Journal of the American Medical Association, arguing that the shape surrounding God in the creation of Adam corresponds with precise anatomical accuracy to a sagittal cross-section of the human brain. The correspondence he mapped was specific rather than approximate. He identified the frontal lobe, the brainstem, the pituitary gland, the optic chiasm, and the basilar artery, each of them locatable within the outlines of Michelangelo's composition. The painting had been carrying this for nearly 5 centuries before anyone with anatomical training stood under the vault and looked at the shape from the right angle. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Meshberger accompanied his analysis with a diagram overlaying the outline of a sagittal brain cross-section onto the painted shape, and the correspondence it revealed was precise rather than impressionistic. The frontal lobe occupies the upper dome of the mantle, where the drapery rounds above the figure of God. The brainstem trails from the lower edge of the composition where the drapery descends. The cerebellum is present in the lower right. An attendant figure's arm curves along the line corresponding to the optic chiasm, and the small female figure pressed against God's left side sits at the position where the pituitary gland appears in the anatomical cross-section. Each structure is named, and each corresponding element in the painting is locatable at the position that structure occupies in the anatomical diagram. The correspondence holds across multiple specifically identified structures without requiring distortion of either the painting or the anatomy to make it work. What made this reading credible was the documentary record surrounding it. Michelangelo's engagement with human anatomy was the foundation on which his entire understanding of the human form was built, and it was pursued with a thoroughness that placed him far outside the conventions of his period. In the 1480s, while still in his teens, Michelangelo obtained permission from the prior of the Church of Santo Spirito in Florence to study the bodies of the dead. The prior, Niccolo Bicchiolini, granted him access to the hospital's mortuary in exchange for a carved wooden crucifix that Michelangelo made for the high altar of the church. This transaction is documented in the historical record, and the crucifix itself, long believed lost, was identified at the Casa Buonarroti in Florence in 1962. Michelangelo spent months working through cadavers by candlelight, cutting into the structures beneath the skin and examining what the exterior surface of the human body does not reveal. He was acquiring knowledge that no workshop training, no textbook of the period, and no academic program could have given him. The prior received a carved Christ. Michelangelo received a direct understanding of the structures inside the human body that would inform every surface he subsequently painted or sculpted. The extent of this study is suggested by the consistency with which anatomical precision appears across his output from this point forward. He continued to seek access to cadavers beyond his initial arrangement at Santo Spirito, obtaining similar permissions at hospitals in Rome as his career required. The documentary record of these later arrangements is less complete than the Santo Spirito exchange, but the anatomical accuracy visible across his output from the early Madonna of the Stairs through the final unfinished Pietà in the Museo dell'Opera del Duomo in Florence suggests a knowledge base that was continuously applied across 6 decades of working life. It did not diminish with age. The Rondinini Pietà, which Michelangelo was still working on days before his death in 1564, shows the same attention to the weight distribution of a supported human body that marks his earliest surviving works. The studies he produced during this period have not survived intact, but their influence is readable across the entirety of his output. The musculature of the figures in the Sistine ceiling is anatomically accurate rather than generalized. The tendons attach to bone at the correct angles. The distribution of mass across the bodies of the prophets and sibyls reflects direct study of the human skeleton, not the approximations a draftsman working only from live models would produce. Scholars of Renaissance anatomy have used Michelangelo's painted figures as evidence in reconstructing the anatomical knowledge available in the early 16th century, because the figures are that specific and that consistent in their accuracy. His anatomical knowledge was, by the time he began the Sistine Commission in 1508, substantially more extensive than that of most practicing physicians of the period. Andreas Vesalius, whose De Humani Corporis Fabrica would become the foundational text of Western anatomy when it appeared in 1543, was not born until 1514, 6 years after Michelangelo began work on the ceiling. Michelangelo was working from direct observation of anatomical structures that Vesalius would later codify for the first time in a major published synthesis. The artist's knowledge predated the text, and it came from the body itself rather than from any document. The commission for the ceiling arrived under circumstances that Michelangelo found professionally unwelcome. Pope Julius II had initially engaged him for a tomb, a sculptural project of considerable ambition that Michelangelo regarded as the central work of that phase of his career. The ceiling was proposed as a separate undertaking, a decorative program the artist described as outside his primary competence. His professional identity was that of a sculptor. Painting the vault of a papal chapel was not the work he had come to Rome to do, and his correspondence from the period reflects a resistance he eventually, and consequentially, set aside. The program initially conceived for the vault was modest, by comparison with what was eventually produced. The 12 apostles, in a conventional decorative arrangement, were to occupy the ceiling. What Michelangelo proposed, after securing the freedom to expand the scope of the commission, was one of the most complex theological and visual programs produced in the Western tradition. 9 narrative panels from the Book of Genesis running along the central axis of the vault, flanked by pairs of ignudi whose presence in the composition has no obvious theological precedent, and whose function in the iconographic program has been debated without resolution for more than a century. Surrounding these central panels were 12 prophets and sibyls, the ancestors of Christ occupying the spandrels and lunettes, and 4 large corner spandrels depicting episodes from the Hebrew Scriptures. The final count of individual figures across the ceiling exceeds 300. Buon fresco permits no surface correction. Pigment applied to freshly laid wet plaster, the intonaco, bonds to the wall surface as the plaster sets. Once the intonaco dries, the giornata, the section of plaster laid for a single day's work, is permanent. Compositional errors discovered after the intonaco has set require the physical removal of the plaster and the laying of a fresh section before work can resume. Every form that reaches the finished surface was determined in the cartoon before the plaster was touched. Every final form on the ceiling is the product of a decision that was made, refined, and committed to before a brush touched the wall. The medium does not accommodate second thoughts at the surface. Michelangelo worked the ceiling in sections across 4 years, from 1508 to 1512. He designed his own scaffolding rather than using the structure initially proposed by Bramante, an arched wooden platform that allowed him to stand upright while painting overhead rather than lying on his back, as is sometimes incorrectly reported. Contemporary accounts describe conditions that most artists would have found prohibitive. The physical demands of working with arms raised continuously above the head, in the position required by the curved vault, produced a documented effect on his posture and, by his own account in letters written during the campaign, on his eyesight. A letter written to a friend in 1510, which has survived in the correspondence record, includes a small self-portrait sketch showing the artist with his head bent back and his arm extended upward, a posture he described as having bent him like a bow. He was at this point approximately halfway through the commission, working in the sections of the ceiling that contained the creation of Adam. The vault itself introduced a perceptual problem that no artist had previously attempted to solve at this scale. The ceiling curves on multiple axes, and figures painted at the proportions correct for a flat surface would appear compressed when seen from the floor 18 meters below. Michelangelo's solution was to elongate his figures systematically in the upper registers of the composition to compensate for the perceptual adjustment imposed by the viewing angle. The prophets, the sibyls, and the ignudi all appear correct from the floor. On the surface of the vault, they are drawn at proportions they do not appear to have. Applying this correction consistently across more than 300 figures over 4 years of continuous work is the structural context within which any claim about Michelangelo's compositional premeditation must be understood. An artist capable of sustaining that level of calculated distortion across an entire ceiling is not an artist who produced the outline of the mantle surrounding God by accident. The Vatican's restoration campaign between 1980 and 1994, carried out by the Vatican Museums with technical support from the Nippon Television Network Corporation, produced infrared reflectography documentation of the Sinopia drawings and cartoons that Michelangelo prepared as compositional guides. These documents reveal an artist making deliberate revisions between the preparatory stage and the finished surface. In the creation of Adam specifically, the revisions in the area of the mantle surrounding God move consistently toward a more precisely bounded form. The shape enclosing the figure of God in the finished fresco is more carefully defined at its boundary than the earlier preparatory evidence suggests it would have been. The revision refines a form already established, moving it toward a more specific outline. The outline arrived at through this revision is the outline Meshberger identified as corresponding to a sagittal brain section. The Sinopia documents also preserve the sequence in which Michelangelo worked across the vault. He began at the entrance end of the chapel, painting the later episodes of the Genesis narrative first, and moved toward the altar end over the course of the campaign. The creation of Adam, located in the fourth of the 9 central panels from the altar end, was painted approximately halfway through the commission, after Michelangelo had been living with the compositional demands of the ceiling for roughly 2 years and had fully developed his solution to the perceptual distortion imposed by the vault's curvature. By the time he reached this panel, he was working at the highest level of technical confidence the commission had yet demanded of him. The revision to the mantle outline in the creation of Adam was made by an artist who had by that point demonstrated that he could manage the medium at this scale without error. The revision was a choice, not a recovery. The theological implication Meshberger's paper identified carries a weight the published art historical literature has been slow to assimilate. God is depicted, in Michelangelo's treatment of the Genesis narrative, as transmitting something to Adam at the moment of creation. The standard theological reading holds that what is transmitted is life itself. The anatomical reading proposes a more specific argument, that Michelangelo encoded in the composition a visual statement about the divine origin of human intellect, placing within the shape surrounding the creator a reference to the organ through which human reasoning operates, so that the gap between the extending finger of God and the not yet animated hand of Adam represents not merely the gift of breath, but the transmission of mind. This reading does not conflict with the theological tradition. It specifies it. Michelangelo's intellectual formation had taken place in the orbit of Lorenzo de' Medici's court in Florence during the 1480s and early 1490s, in an environment shaped by the Neoplatonic philosophy cultivated at Marsilio Ficino's Platonic Academy. The Neoplatonists had developed a theology in which the divine gift to humanity was specifically the capacity for reason, the faculty of contemplation through which the human being could perceive and participate in divine intelligence. Pico della Mirandola's Oration on the Dignity of Man, composed in 1486 when Michelangelo was 11 years old and already in the orbit of Lorenzo's household, argued that what distinguishes humanity from every other created order is the freedom conferred by reason, the cognitive capacity to ascend or descend through the orders of creation by an act of intellectual will. An artist formed in this context, commissioned to paint the moment at which God gives something to the first human being, had received from his intellectual formation a specific answer to the question of what that something is. The divine gift is the mind. The mantle surrounding God at the moment of creation is shaped like the structure through which the mind operates. Encoding secondary meaning in devotional painting had precedent in the period. Symbolic programs in altarpieces and fresco cycles routinely contained layers of meaning accessible only to viewers with theological or philosophical training sufficient to read them. What distinguishes the anatomical layer in the creation of Adam, if the reading holds, is the nature of what was concealed. The hidden content is an anatomical fact, placed within a painted shape, accessible only to a viewer with training in a field the painting's patron did not expect the artist to possess. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything, and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. There is a second panel on the ceiling that the anatomical reading addresses. The separation of light from darkness, the ninth and final panel in the Genesis sequence, and the one Michelangelo painted last, depicts the figure of God from below as he drives light and darkness apart above the viewer's head. The figure appears at an unusual angle, with the neck extended and the throat exposed, in a position that corresponds to the structures of the human brainstem and cerebellum, as they appear when the head is tilted back at exactly that angle. This correspondence was identified by Raphael Tamargo and Ian Sook, neurosurgeons at the Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine, in a paper published in the journal Neurosurgery in 2010. They argued that the undulations at the center of God's throat and chest in the panel correspond to the ventral surface of the human brainstem, and that the figure's posture in this final panel makes the brainstem reference legible in a way that a conventional frontal representation of the same figure would not. The finding was accompanied by anatomical diagrams laid over details of the fresco, and the correspondence they document is specific, named structures at named positions within the composition, 2 panels in the Genesis sequence, the first and the last, both carrying anatomical references identified by physicians working from direct anatomical training rather than by art historians working from the iconographic tradition, both consistent with what the documentary record establishes about Michelangelo's engagement with cadaveric study across his career. The pattern across the bookends of the central narrative sequence has not been adequately addressed in the mainstream iconographic literature, and the consistency of the finding across 2 separate panels, separated by 4 years of continuous work on the ceiling, is not something the standard methodological objection adequately accounts for. The anatomical reading of the separation of light from darkness also carries an implication that extends the structure of the argument in the creation of Adam. In the creation of Adam, the shape surrounding God at the moment of transmitting something to the first human being corresponds to the brain in cross-section. In the separation of light from darkness, the figure of God at the moment of the first act of creation in the Genesis narrative reveals the brainstem in the structure of his extended throat. The Genesis sequence on the ceiling begins at the altar end with the first creative act and ends at the entrance end with the creation of the human being. The anatomical references appear at both ends of that sequence. Whether this pairing was part of an intentional program is a question the available evidence does not settle. The consistency of the finding, documented by 2 independent teams of medical professionals working 2 decades apart, is established. The art historical community's response to both findings has been uneven. The readings have been engaged seriously in some quarters, cited extensively in medical and anatomical publications, and examined by a number of scholars working in the iconographic tradition. The major synthetic accounts of the ceiling published in the decades since 1990 have addressed them briefly or not at all. The methodological objection raised most consistently is that the attribution of deliberate anatomical encoding to a painter working under the constraints of buon fresco on a composition of this complexity is improbable. The objection has weight. The response from those who have engaged the physical evidence most carefully is that the restoration's infrared documentation describes the physical object. The revision to the mantle outline is documented. The direction of the revision is documented. The correspondence between the finished form and the anatomical structure is documented by professionals working from anatomical training. What has not been provided by those who contest the reading is an alternative account of these documented facts that explains why the revision to the mantle outline moved in the direction of greater anatomical precision. The question of anatomical content in Renaissance art is not itself without precedent in the scholarly literature. Scholars of Leonardo da Vinci have identified anatomical references in several of his painted and drawn works, and the argument that artists trained in direct anatomical observation carried that knowledge into their compositional decisions is not inherently contested. What distinguishes the Michelangelo case from the general argument is the specificity of the correspondence Meshberger and the Johns Hopkins team documented, and the physical evidence of directed revision that the restoration's infrared record provides. The argument is not that an artist with anatomical knowledge might have been thinking about anatomy while composing a figure. The argument is that a specific painted shape was revised toward greater correspondence with a specific named anatomical structure, and that this revision is preserved in the documentation the conservation campaign produced. The restoration campaign's most visible result was the recovery of the ceiling's original color. Centuries of lamp soot, accumulated from candles burned through hundreds of years of liturgical observance, had progressively darkened the surface. Earlier conservation interventions had compounded the alteration. In the early 17th century, a coating of vegetable-based animal glue was applied to the surface to consolidate areas where pigment had begun to separate from the intonaco. The application darkened the colors it was meant to preserve, and its chemical interaction with the fresco surface altered the original color relationships in ways that accumulated over time into an appearance substantially different from what Michelangelo had produced. By the time the restoration campaign began in 1980, the ceiling had not been its own color for a very long time. What emerged from beneath the accumulations was a palette of considerable clarity. The lime greens in the garments of the Sibyls, the pale lavenders in the drapery of several prophet figures, the sharp azurite blues and clean ochres applied across the ceiling were not the palette of a somber, heavily shadowed fresco. They were the palette of an artist who understood the optical behavior of color over distance. The ceiling is 18 meters above the floor. At that distance, in the available light of the chapel, colors appear muted by the intervening atmosphere. Michelangelo painted his colors lighter and more saturated than close inspection would require, so that they would read correctly from the floor. The scholarship on the ceiling's chromatic language formed before the restoration was formed against a surface that could not demonstrate this optical intelligence, because the original surface had been buried under centuries of accumulation. The infrared documentation produced by the campaign is the most complete record available of Michelangelo's compositional process across the ceiling. The Sinopia drawings show his initial placement of forms on the Orichio layer beneath the final intonico. The cartoons, transferred to the intonico by incision or pouncing, show the refined compositional decisions that followed. The finished surface, examined through raking light and infrared reflectography, shows where Michelangelo departed from the cartoon at the point of execution. The final refinements introduced in the act of painting after everything that could be resolved in the preparatory phase had been resolved. These departures are refinements rather than corrections, and they move the forms toward greater specificity rather than away from it. Michelangelo did not publish his anatomical studies. He did not teach anatomy formally. The treatise on anatomy that Vasari reports he intended to write in collaboration with Realdo Colombo, the anatomist at the Sapienza in Rome, with whom he spent time in his later years, was never completed. The anatomical knowledge he accumulated over decades of direct cadaveric study entered his art rather than the published record of medicine. What he knew, the surfaces he painted and sculpted hold. The document explaining what he intended to communicate with what he knew does not exist, and the surfaces themselves, in the absence of that document, have had to wait for readers with the right training to ask the right questions. That the anatomical precision of the Sistine ceiling is not an isolated case in Michelangelo's output is worth stating plainly. The figures in the Last Judgment, which he painted on the altar wall of the same chapel between 1536 and 1541, more than 2 decades after completing the ceiling, demonstrate the same accuracy in the rendering of musculature and skeletal structure that characterizes the vault. The marble Pietà in St. Peter's Basilica, completed before 1500 when Michelangelo was 24 years old, shows an understanding of how weight distributes across a relaxed human body that is consistent with direct cadaveric study, rather than observation of the living model alone. The knowledge was present at the beginning of his career and remained active at its close. The ceiling is the largest single surface he worked, and therefore the surface on which that knowledge had the most room to operate, but it was not the only context in which it was applied. The small female figure pressed against God's left side in the creation of Adam has attracted iconographic debate across the centuries without receiving a persuasive identification. She has been proposed as Eve, as yet uncreated, as Sophia, the personification of divine wisdom, and as an unnamed attendant serving compositional rather than iconographic functions. Within the anatomical mapping Meshberger produced, she sits at the position corresponding to the pituitary gland. The pituitary gland was not formally identified as a distinct anatomical structure in a published text until Vesalius did so in 1543, more than 3 decades after Michelangelo painted the creation of Adam. Whether Michelangelo had observed and identified the structure through direct cadaveric study before it received its published name is not documented. The placement of the figure at the position the anatomical mapping assigns to that structure is consistent with the reading and has not been accounted for by the iconographic alternatives so far proposed. The theological politics of anatomical study in the early 16th century bear directly on the question of why content concealed in the ceiling would have taken the specific form it did. Access to cadavers required institutional permission through specific channels, as the Santo Spirito arrangement demonstrates. The theological objection to dissection, that it violated the sanctity of the body created in the image of God, had not been formally resolved by the period of the Sistine Commission. Encoding a reference to the brain in a painting of the moment at which God creates a human being could be read sympathetically as a statement about the divine origin of the intellect, consistent with the Neoplatonic philosophy of Michelangelo's formation. Encoding it in a form accessible only to viewers with anatomical training placed it beyond the reach of readers who would not have welcomed the suggestion in a painting located in the principal chapel of the Vatican. The concealment protected the content by restricting its readability to an audience the content itself assumed. Giorgio Vasari, writing his account of Michelangelo's life in 1550 and expanding it substantially in 1568, described the Sistine ceiling as having enlightened the world of painting and as having demonstrated possibilities that no prior work had shown artists they possessed. His account draws on direct acquaintance with Michelangelo in his later years and remains the fullest biographical record the period produced. It contains no reference to the anatomical content of the creation of Adam. Whether Vasari did not know it was there, which is entirely possible given that the content is legible only to viewers with direct anatomical training, or whether he knew and chose not to record it in a text directed at a readership that included the ecclesiastical establishment, the historical record does not clarify. Both possibilities are consistent with the evidence available. The ceiling was revealed in stages. Julius II pressed Michelangelo to uncover the completed first half of the vault in 1511, before the entire program was finished. Contemporary accounts record a significant response from the artists and patrons who came to see it. Raphael, according to Vasari, revised works in progress after seeing the unveiled sections. The creation of Adam was among the panels uncovered in 1512 when the second half of the ceiling was opened. The accounts that survive describe an audience that recognized it had encountered something outside the category of work available to study in the existing tradition. Michelangelo was 68 years old when Vesalius published the Fabrica in 1543, placing into print the anatomical structures he had been studying by direct observation since the 1480s. He lived until 1564 at the age of 88, surviving to see the published codification of forms his hands had examined in the mortuaries of Florence and Rome decades before the plates of the Fabrica existed. His late letters return frequently to themes of the inadequacy of the made object to contain divine reality. Whether this was piety appropriate to an artist of his period and standing, or something more specific, the written record, which lacks the relevant document, cannot determine. The question the archive has not settled in the decades since Meshberger's paper is the question of intention, and the archive is not structured to settle it. The infrared documentation shows the revision to the mantle outline, but does not explain why the revision was made. The Synopia shows Michelangelo's starting points, but does not name his destinations. The finished surface shows the form he arrived at, but does not state what the form was meant to carry. What the physical record of the ceiling establishes is that the anatomical correspondence in the creation of Adam is the result of a revision that moved the form toward greater anatomical precision. Whether Michelangelo placed it there deliberately, and for whom, and with what expectation that anyone would find it, are questions the ceiling has been holding since 1512 without being compelled to answer directly. The archive continues to accept material. The infrared documentation will be re-examined by researchers with different questions than the teams who originally produced it brought to the work. The iconographic status of the small female figure and her relationship to the anatomical mapping will eventually receive the systematic attention the literature has not yet given it. The restoration documentation continues to be accessed by scholars who bring to it knowledge that the conservation teams who produced it did not possess. The ceiling has been examined for more than 500 years. The account of what it contains is not finished. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.